What up, YouTube? Here with a post-fight video of the Raymond Ford versus Otabek Kholmatov fight. Now, this was for the WBA Featherweight title, and before I give y'all the summary of what happened in the fight, I'm going to tell y'all the results first. Raymond Ford became the new WBA Featherweight champion after stopping Kholmatov in the 12th and final round, and there was only a few seconds remaining in the fight, and the referee stepped in to call a halt to the bout after Kholmatov looked as if he was out on his feet, and the ropes was holding Kholmatov up when he had his back against the corner when Raymond Ford decided to step on the gas pedal and press the action and pressure Kholmatov relentlessly and aggressively after he had saw that Kholmatov was wounded after flurries of shots came from Raymond Ford, and that came from a close range uppercut that landed flush, and then he landed another flush clean hook on the inside. I believe it was with his lead right hand that he landed that hook with after he had landed that clean uppercut with his back left hand. And Kholmatov looked as if he was floored after they got out of the clinch, but because they were in a clinch, that Kholmatov was holding on to Raymond Ford because Ford had him hurt after Ford had successfully landed his attacks followed by those clean, effective shots that he had landed flush on Kholmatov. And when the referee had stepped in to break that clinch that they were tied in, Kholmatov lost balance, and it looked more like that Kholmatov didn't have his footing up under him, hence why he had dropped. But there wasn't clean landed punches that floored Kholmatov, hence why the referee didn't rule it a knockdown. And I know the commentary team was saying that it should have been called a knockdown because of the punches that was being thrown while they were close in range and tied together. But I could see why, especially when a live fight is going on and they're in the midst of a live action fight. It's hard to catch these calls, and that didn't matter because after Kholmatov got back up on his feet, it obviously showed that Kholmatov didn't have his footing under him, and Ford knew that Kholmatov was wounded and hurt from the previous assault, hence why Ford went at him, and when Ford went at Kholmatov couldn't defend himself. Now, could the referee had the fight continue? Absolutely. It was only less than 10 seconds left in the whole fight, and Kholmatov didn't drop, he didn't collapse. But that's where that what if, that 50-50, and to be clear about it, I'm going to call it for what it is. That's where that theoretical BS comes into play, where if Kholmatov could have survived those few remaining seconds, then Kholmatov could have possibly walked away the winner, because on my personal scorecard, prior to the stoppage, I had the fight scored 6 rounds for Kholmatov, 4 rounds for Ford, and I had the 7th round scored a draw. And the 12th round would have went to Raymond Ford because that was a clear round where Ford had won that round. And Kholmatov was in deep waters in the final round, and The best round for Raymond Ford, other than the 12th round, was the 8th round. And as the fight went on towards the latter end, that's when Ford started to look like the momentum was favoring him, while in the beginning of the fight, Kholmatov was more elusive, he was more fluid, he was more active, and he was pressing the action from the beginning of the fight. But the crisp counter punchings from Raymond Ford was wearing on Kholmatov in the latter rounds. And the body work of Ford was more efficient. And as I have said, if you watch the entire fight, Ford was doing the more efficient work as far as landing the more effective, cleaner punches. Kholmatov was throwing more, he was more aggressive, he was working off of volume, and he was pressing Raymond Ford. While in the beginning of the fight, Raymond Ford, he looked a little overwhelmed by the work rate of Kholmatov, but he did a good job at staying composed and staying in the pocket and not making it look as if he was overwhelmed by the attacks that was launched from Kholmatov. And Ford, even in the beginning of the fight, was landing the more cleaner punches. But he wasn't throwing enough. He wasn't active enough. He would only throw in between the shots that Kholmatov was throwing. And whenever there was a room of opportunity for Raymond Ford to land a counter punch, that's when Ford would throw. It's to say, to not waste any shots. Let's make every shot that he throws count and land accurately. Ford was fighting from more of a technical aspect rather than mano y mano, let's go toe-to-toe, blow for blow. And Kholmatov, whenever he'd get too wild and ahead of himself, to sort of say, that's when Ford would make him pay for his technical errors when Kholmatov would get overtly aggressive whenever Kholmatov would find success in his attacks. And when Ford would figure out the rhythm of Kholmatov and his game plan and figure out Kholmatov's attack, that's when Ford got more comfortable and had stylistically adapted to the pace of Kholmatov, and Kholmatov was dictating the pace of the fight throughout the majority of the fight. Ford was just able to adapt to the pace of the fight. But once Kholmatov and his rhythm and his style was figured out, that's when Ford started to throw more than he was at the beginning of the fight. And when Ford would counter Kholmatov's aggression with aggressive style back, he would find some success as well. For example, in the 8th round, Kholmatov was backing off of Ford because Ford was landing some vicious shots in an aggressive manner, and that would back Kholmatov off of him. But in the 9th round, it looked like, I don't know if Ford was trying to reserve energy to maintain his stamina for the rest of the fight if it were to go the distance, or if Kholmatov turned it up on him, because Kholmatov said in his corner that the 8th round was without a shadow of a doubt a round for Raymond Ford. Now Kholmatov would have to turn it up to gain the momentum back and have the leverage back on his side. So he decided to turn it up on Ford, and Ford didn't really have the counter attack to match the offense of Kholmatov in the ninth round and on. And Raymond Ford didn't step on the gas pedal to match the volume and work rate of Kholmatov, nor did he really have the answers, because if you look at the ninth round closely, you could see Ford was landing some successful shots, and he was stepping on the gas pedal, but when Kholmatov decided to turn up his offense more and get a little more aggressive, that's when Ford would back off of him. And Kholmatov found success in turning up in his offense, and Ford didn't have a counter answer when Kholmatov got more aggressive, because in the 10th round and in the 11th round, Kholmatov was consistent with his work rate and his pressure on Ford, and Ford couldn't step on that gas pedal to match the attack that Kholmatov was bringing to him. And that's when Kholmatov started to show signs of desperateness, because of what happened in the 8th round. And then the 9th round was a close round, but Kholmatov at the end of the 9th round, when he decided to turn it up, and Ford couldn't fight the fight that he wanted to fight because of the action that Kholmatov was pressing towards him towards the end of the 9th round. Because if you look at the beginning and the middle of the 9th round, Ford was still having his ways with landing the more effective, cleaner shots until Kholmatov stepped on the gas pedal. And then in the 10th round, it was all Kholmatov. And then in the 11th round, Kholmatov started to show signs of fatigue, and Ford was landing some successful shots, but it was close rounds, a close round either ways. But then in the 12th round, that's when Ford landed a devastating shot, and that's what led to the TKO stoppage for Ford to get the win. Now, I understand from the referee's perspective, because nobody wants to see a fighter get knocked out cold. And if Ford, which looked like he was on his way to close out the show, doesn't matter what was left as far as the time remaining for that fight, because it was in the final round when that was happening, if Ford were to land another devastating shot, it could have been very likely that we could have saw Kholmatov get knocked out cold. And I'm not going to compare this fight to Julio Cesar Chavez's fight versus, what was his name, Meldrick Taylor. And I don't mean no disrespect when I said what was his name. I was just trying to refresh my memory. I don't want to sound disrespectful to boxing legends. That's why I had to correct myself right quick. But fans, this fight wasn't of that magnitude, but how this fight ended, it was in that liking. And we didn't see Kholmatov get dropped like Taylor did versus Chavez in this fight versus Ford, but that's what we could have seen. But there was controversy with that fight and how that fight got stopped. That's why there could be a dispute, a argument for how this fight could have got stopped, because Kholmatov didn't technically get dropped officially, but it looked as if he was out on his feet, and he was definitely in trouble for those last few remaining seconds of the fight. Now, as I said, could he have had continued if the referee would have let the fight go on and had the fight finish? Could he have finished the fight? There was definitely a strong chance of Kholmatov finishing that fight without getting technically stopped. Now, does this call for a rematch with Kholmatov and Ford? marketably and promotionally speaking, it would be a better look for not only Ford and his team, but for Top Rank to try and catapult Ford to the next level and move on and make it seem as if it was a hard-fought, successful victory without any controversy, to have him move on to the next level, to say, and have them take on new challengers for his newly won WBA featherweight title. Now, is Kholmatov deserving of another shot? Yes, he is. And not only because of how the fight ended, because as I had mentioned before, if the fight would have went on, and if Kholmatov wouldn't have hit the canvas, because if there was a chance of Kholmatov finishing the fight without hitting the floor, there would have been a chance of Kholmatov being knocked down, if not out, for those last few remaining seconds that was left in the fight prior to him getting stopped. And as I have said, if Kholmatov were to get dropped, I would have either had that fight scored a draw, or I would have still had Kholmatov winning by a point. So Kholmatov, if he would have made it to the end of the fight, then it's a strong possibility that Kholmatov could have walked away the new WBA featherweight champion. Now, I don't know how the official judges had the fight scored. I did not check up on the post-fight results and the post-fight coverages when it came to media coverage, but I don't know how the judges had officially had the fight scored. Now, knowing the politics of the sport of boxing, it would have been likely that the judges would have had that fight scored in favor of Ford, politically speaking, because I know how the boxing game and the politics gets down and how they favor the more liked, marketable fighter. And Ford was the A side of the fight. And that's regardless of the fact that both fighters were even on paper, both undefeated. I'll say Kholmatov had the more impressive record on paper because 12 wins, no defeats, with 11 of those wins coming by knockout, while Ford, who had 15 prior fights before this fight, 14 wins, not as many stoppages, and no defeats, but one draw on his record. And as I have said, because of how this fight played out and how competitive it was, and stylistically speaking, it was a good fight. It was a good, entertaining fight, and that's why I would not mind seeing another fight with Ford and Kholmatov. Now, I did talk about this in the video where I had talked about Luis Alberto Lopez versus Abe. That was the co-feature bout on that same card where Ford and Kholmatov main evented. And I did say, because there is no current unified featherweight champions, that a unified title bout in the future for the featherweight division to be a good look. But with the resume that Raymond Ford got going on right now, he is the most unexperienced champion at featherweight right now. He just recently came onto the scene as a featherweight champion. And I'm going to be honest, this was the first entire fight that I've seen of Raymond Ford. Now, was I impressed? I've heard about him, and I was impressed with his skills and his resilience and his fortitude and him performing at a high level, competing for a title. But he's still green compared to all the other champions and even non-champions. You compare him to a guy like Mauricio Lara, Josh Warrington, he doesn't have as much experience as guys like that. And for Raymond Ford, who's still considered to be a prospect, despite the fact that he's a champion, he's still a young and up-and-coming green fighter. And for him to go for a unification bout immediately after he had just won the WBA featherweight title versus somebody who has just as much professional experience as him, for him to step in there with a guy like Luis Alberto Lopez is far-fetched with the current stages that Raymond Ford is on right now. And the more sensible bout, if Raymond Ford and his team is looking to have him become a unified featherweight champion, will be versus the WBO featherweight champion Rafael Espinoza, who, much like Raymond Ford, had recently came up as not only champions but made a splash onto the boxing public as guys that weren't that noticed as not only well-known faces in the sport of boxing, but in the featherweight division. Raymond Ford and Rafael Espinoza wasn't on the level of a guy like Robesi Ramirez, Luis Alberto Lopez, Mauricio Lara, Ray Vargas, Josh Warrington, Lee Wood, and guys like that. And that's why I say that title unification bout with Ford and Espinoza is not only a less dangerous fight, and I say that with all due respect to Espinoza, but the streak, the current momentum that Luis Alberto Lopez has got going on right now, I don't think nobody in the featherweight division is going to want to fight him. And with all due respect to Raymond Ford, Rafael Espinoza, and I know that fight versus Kholmatov was even on paper, and Kholmatov, him being fairly matched to Raymond Ford on paper is still not enough, and I say that with all due respect because Ford is a champion, and now he, without a shadow of a doubt, is regarded as a top elite featherweight because he is one of the 4 champions in the featherweight division. We have no choice but to respect him as a featherweight champion, and that makes him amongst the top of the featherweights. And Robesi Ramirez has more experience than a Kholmatov or a Ford. And Rafael Espinoza was able to pull off that upset versus the highly favored Robesi Ramirez, who was expected to put on a showcase and make light work out of Espinoza. And he wasn't successful in doing that. And that fight ended up being one of the best fights and one of the biggest upsets for last year. And if they don't have a rematch, that fight with Ford and Espinoza sounds more ideal than a title unification bout with Ford and Lopez. But as I had said, for Espinoza to do that versus Ramirez was more impressive because people weren't expecting Espinoza to be able to do that versus Ramirez. People were saying it's a 50-50 fight with Ford and Kholmatov. And if Ford takes on any of the highly ranked contenders at featherweight, according to the WBA, any highly ranked contender that the WBA puts in front of Raymond Ford, and if Raymond Ford successfully defeats whoever the WBA has him in there with, and he has one or two more fights, and he successfully defends his WBA featherweight title and looks good while doing it, then we can say, depending on his performance, that Raymond Ford is ready to take on a fighter like a Luis Alberto Lopez, like a Mauricio Lara, like a Josh Warrington, and Robesi Ramirez, Rafael Espinoza. Once he gets over that reputation of being a prospect and gains more experience fighting at a championship level, then we can say Ford is that guy. Him having a title already cements him as being that guy, but it would further legitimize Ford as that guy amongst the top of the featherweights if he gets more bouts under his belt and looks good while doing it and is succeeding at defending his WBA featherweight titles. Now, if he fights any of these fighters that I had named that competes at a high level amongst the top of the featherweights, it would be a good look and a tough challenge for a young fighter like Raymond Ford. And those fights with the other champions other than Ray Vargas, who doesn't have his fights worked with Top Rank, Lopez, Espinoza, they both worked with Top Rank. Lopez was featured on the same card where Ford won his WBA featherweight title. That's why those in-house bouts are easier of a fight to make happen than cross-promotional bout. Now, I don't know what's up with the WBA rankings, and I don't know if Wikipedia is a good enough source as far as the WBA rankings goes, and I don't think the WBA website has updated their featherweight rankings, but there is vacant slots when it comes to the featherweight rankings when it comes to the WBA organization. And when I checked on Wikipedia, it has said that Stephen Fulton is ranked amongst the top featherweights according to the WBA when he hasn't even fought in the featherweight division, at least last time I checked. And Stephen Fulton, he competes at super bantamweight. Now, I don't know why they have him up there. I don't know if it's a glitch, but they had another Argentine fighter who competes at super bantamweight as well and hasn't made a reputation competing in the featherweight division as a top 10 ranked contender in the featherweight division according to the WBA. And I thought that was a funny factor that I shared with y'all. But other than that, I don't know what's going on with the WBA rankings. I don't know if they haven't updated it yet, and it's relevant that I mention it because Raymond Ford is the current WBA featherweight champion, and that's the fight that I'm talking about right now. Hence why I brought up the WBA rankings. I don't know who Top Rank and Raymond Ford and his camp and the WBA will have Raymond Ford face next. And as I said, whoever they get him in there next with to defend his WBA featherweight title that he newly won, after one or two more bouts, as I said before, and if he successfully puts on a great performance, then we can say he's truly ready to try and unify the featherweight titles or get in there with the likes of Mauricio Lara, Josh Warrington, and fighters like that, or even a Ray Vargas, Nick Ball, Ruben Villa. And that does it for this post-fight video. Subscribe to this channel if y'all want for more content. Like this video and share this video. And click the links in the description to show y'all support for this channel. Anything and all things will be appreciated. And I'm out of here, y'all. Be good and peace.